First words Miriam spoke at the Broken Arrow Ranch were a lie, and as they left her lips, the prize stallion collapsed in the corral, blood frothing from its mouth. She stood there barefoot in the dust, her torn dress hanging like burial shrouds, watching the magnificent beast convulse its final moments while ranch hands scrambled in confusion. What she'd told them about being robbed by bandits wasn't entirely false. But the real truth about why she'd walked 30 miles through the desert would have sent them running faster than spooked cattle. Samuel Hayes, the ranch owner, rushed toward his dying horse with the frantic energy of a man watching his fortune bleed out in the dirt. His weathered hands shook as he knelt beside the stallion, searching for wounds that didn't exist, bullet holes that weren't there. The animal's eyes had gone glassy, its powerful frame now nothing more than expensive meat under the merciless Arizona sun. 3 of his best ranch hands stood frozen, their faces painted with the kind of superstitious fear that runs deeper than rational thought. Miriam pressed her lips together, forcing silence while her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to explain, to comfort, to offer the kind of meaningless condolences that decent people shared in moments of loss. But she'd learned the terrible arithmetic of her condition. Words equals death, silence equals mercy. She could only stand there like a beautiful scarecrow, her bare feet burning against the packed earth, watching Samuel grieve for a creature she'd killed with nothing more than breath and deception. The ranch hands whispered among themselves, their voices carrying the nervous energy of men confronting something beyond their understanding. One of them, a young cowboy with earnest eyes and calloused hands, kept glancing between the dead horse and the strange woman who'd appeared like a mirage from the wasteland. His name was David, and he possessed the dangerous combination of curiosity and compassion that made good men do foolish things. Sarah Hayes emerged from the main house, her apron still dusted with flour from the morning's baking. She was Samuel's wife, a woman whose beauty had been carved into something sharper by years of harsh desert living. Her gaze swept from her husband's anguished form to the mysterious stranger, and something in her expression suggested she understood that this woman's arrival marked the beginning of something terrible. Women often possessed intuitions that men dismissed, but Sarah's instincts had been honed by decades of frontier survival. Samuel finally rose from beside his dead horse, his face cycling through grief, confusion, and the kind of anger that needed a target. His eyes found Miriam, taking in her bedraggled appearance, her bare feet, the way she stood so unnaturally still in the aftermath of tragedy. He was a practical man who'd built his ranch through hard work and harder decisions, but he'd also buried 2 children and knew that sometimes death arrived wearing the face of innocence. "What's your name?" he asked, and Miriam felt the familiar terror rise in her throat. She couldn't stay silent forever, couldn't stand mute while these people decided her fate. But every word carried potential murder. Every syllable might sentence another innocent creature to death. In the distance, she could see other horses in the pasture, cattle grazing peacefully, a dozen barn cats who'd chosen the wrong moment to call this place home. "Miriam," she whispered, and a chicken near the hen house immediately toppled over, its small body hitting the earth with a soft thud that somehow carried across the entire yard. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she witnessed the impossible connection between word and death. Samuel's face went pale beneath his sun-weathered skin, and the ranch hands began backing away, as if Miriam carried some terrible contagion. But David stepped forward instead of retreating, his young face set with determination that reminded her painfully of another man who'd tried to save her. "There's something wrong here," David said, his voice steady despite the supernatural horror unfolding before him. "Something that ain't natural." He looked directly at Miriam, and she saw recognition flickering in his eyes, not of her face, but of her condition. He'd seen something like this before, or heard stories that prepared him for this moment of impossible convergence between word and death. Miriam wanted to run, to disappear back into the desert where her curse could only harm scorpions and rattlesnakes, creatures that deserved the death her voice carried. But exhaustion weighed down her limbs like iron shackles, and the water Samuel's wife had brought her was the first kindness she'd experienced in months of wandering. She was trapped between the terror of what she might do and the desperate human need for connection, for shelter, for the pretense that she might still belong among the living. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold that seemed appropriate for the day's dark revelations. Soon night would fall, and with it would come new opportunities for her curse to manifest in ways these people couldn't imagine. She'd learned that darkness amplified her condition, that whispered words in the small hours carried even more deadly power than daylight conversations. That first night, Miriam discovered that Sarah Hayes possessed the kind of practical wisdom that frontier life carved into women's souls. While Samuel paced the porch like a caged wolf, trying to rationalize what he'd witnessed, Sarah quietly prepared a meal and gestured for Miriam to sit at their kitchen table. The older woman moved with deliberate silence, communicating through looks and gentle touches, instinctively understanding that speech carried danger. David lingered near the kitchen window, ostensibly checking the evening patrol, but actually keeping watch over their mysterious guest. His presence brought both comfort and concern to Miriam, who recognized the signs of a man preparing to involve himself in troubles that could destroy him. She'd seen that expression before, on faces that were now buried beneath unmarked graves, scattered across 3 territories. The kitchen held the warmth of normal domestic life, filled with the sense of fresh bread and coffee that reminded Miriam of times before her condition manifested. Sarah served her plate after plate of food, watching with motherly satisfaction as her guest ate with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been rationing hope along with calories. But even this simple kindness carried weight, because every grateful nod, every appreciative smile pushed Miriam deeper into debt with people who couldn't afford what she might cost them. Samuel finally entered the house, his boots heavy against the wooden floor, his presence filling the room with barely contained tension. He sat across from Miriam, studying her face with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that might save his livelihood. His ranch employed 15 men, supported 3 families, and represented decades of backbreaking work that could be destroyed by whatever dark forces had arrived with this strange woman. "You're going to tell me what happened out there," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting answers. "My horse didn't just drop dead for no reason, and that chicken sure as hell didn't die of coincidence." Miriam felt the words building in her throat like a dam about to burst, but she couldn't risk another death on her conscience. Instead, she reached for the slate that Sarah had thoughtfully provided, writing carefully, "I can't speak freely. Animals die when I do." Samuel read the message aloud, and from somewhere in the barn came the sound of a cat yowling in agony before falling silent. His face went white as he realized that even reading her words aloud carried the same deadly consequences as hearing them from her lips directly. Sarah immediately understood the implications, snatching the slate away and erasing the message with quick, frightened movements. David stepped into the kitchen then, his young face grave with purpose. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "Not exactly like this, but similar. Down in Sonora, there was a woman who brought death with her shadow. Folks said she'd been cursed by a bruja, a witch who didn't like how pretty she was." The comparison made Miriam flinch because it struck closer to truth than this earnest young man could know. Her condition hadn't been born from jealousy over beauty, but it had emerged from feminine power that certain men found threatening. The curse had been placed on her by someone who understood that the cruelest punishments were those that turned a person's greatest gifts into instruments of destruction. Samuel absorbed this information with the practical mindset of a rancher who dealt with drought, disease, and every other catastrophe the desert could conjure. "If she's cursed," he said, "then there's got to be a way to break it. Curses don't just happen for no reason, and they don't last forever if you know what you're doing." Sarah had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, understanding intuitively what her husband was contemplating. She'd married a man who believed every problem had a solution. Every challenge could be overcome through determination and hard work. But she also possessed the wisdom to recognize that some troubles were too dangerous to solve, some mysteries too deadly to unravel. Miriam watched these three people discussing her fate with the detached fascination of someone observing her own execution. They meant well, particularly David, whose earnest desire to help reminded her painfully of the last man who'd tried to save her. But good intentions had a way of multiplying tragedy when supernatural forces were involved, and she'd learned that the people who cared about her were always the ones who paid the highest price. The evening stretched on with careful conversations, conducted mostly through gestures and written notes, but even this limited communication felt dangerous. Miriam could sense her curse growing stronger as night deepened, feeding on the darkness and the proximity of so many innocent lives. In the barn, horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, somehow sensing the predator that had taken residence in their midst. As Sarah prepared a bed for her in the spare room, Miriam caught sight of family photographs on the mantelpiece, images of Samuel and Sarah with two young children who were conspicuously absent from the current household. The pain in Sarah's eyes when she noticed Miriam looking told a story of loss that made the older woman's kindness even more precious and dangerous. David volunteered to sleep in the barn, claiming he wanted to keep watch over the animals, but Miriam understood his real motivation. He was positioning himself as a barrier between her curse and the creatures under his protection, willing to sacrifice himself if necessary to prevent further tragedy. The noble stupidity of his gesture made her heart ache with familiar grief. Morning brought death wearing the innocent face of accident, and this time it was David who paid the price for his heroic intentions. Miriam found him in the barn when she crept out before dawn, hoping to leave before her presence could destroy more of what these good people had built. He lay motionless beside the stall of a mare who died sometime during the night, both of them victims of words he'd spoken trying to comfort animals, made restless by supernatural presence. Sarah's scream when she discovered the bodies could have shattered glass, and it brought Samuel running with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. But when he saw his young ranch hand sprawled in the hay beside the dead horse, his anger transformed into something more dangerous. The cold determination of a man who decided that some threats required extreme measures to neutralize. "You did this," Samuel said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "I don't know how, and I don't much care about the details, but that boy is dead because of you." Miriam wanted to protest, to explain that David had died trying to protect the animals from her curse, speaking gentle words to calm them in their supernatural terror. But every word of explanation would only add more corpses to the count, and she'd learned that truth became irrelevant when delivered by lips that carried death. She could only stand there in the barn's dusty light, accepting blame for crimes she'd committed without intent or malice. Sarah wept over David's body with the grief of a woman who'd lost too many young men to the brutal mathematics of frontier life. She'd buried her own sons years ago, claimed by fever and accident, and David had filled some of the emptiness their deaths had carved in her heart. Now that surrogate son lay still in the hay, another casualty of caring about the wrong woman at the wrong time. But as Sarah mourned, her keen eyes noticed details that her husband had missed in his rage. David's hands were positioned strangely, his fingers arranged as if he'd been trying to form letters in the moments before death took him. The message was unclear, but it suggested he'd died trying to communicate something important, some understanding he'd gained about Miriam's condition in his final moments. The dead mare told a different story than Samuel's accusation suggested. Her body showed no signs of distress or struggle, no indication that she died in fear or pain. Instead, she appeared to have simply laid down and stopped breathing, as if David's final words had carried more mercy than murder. It was a small distinction, but one that suggested Miriam's curse might be more complex than simple killing. Samuel gathered his remaining ranch hands, explaining the situation in terms they could understand. They had a dangerous woman on their property, and she needed to be removed before more good men died. These were practical men who'd faced down rustlers, wolves, and Apache raiders, but supernatural threats required different considerations. Several of them suggested simply shooting her and burying the problem in the desert, but Samuel had enough conscience left to seek alternatives. Meanwhile, Miriam retreated to the house, where she discovered Sarah had been conducting her own investigation. The older woman had arranged a collection of objects on the kitchen table: herbs, stones, and small talismans that suggested familiarity with folk remedies and supernatural protections. Sarah might not understand the exact nature of Miriam's curse, but she recognized the signs of otherworldly interference in natural affairs. "I've been thinking about what David said," Sarah wrote on the slate they'd been using for communication, "about the woman in Sonora. If there's a curse, there might be a way to break it." The hope in Sarah's eyes was almost unbearable, because Miriam had spent months searching for exactly that solution. She'd consulted every curandera, every wise woman, every traveling preacher who claimed knowledge of supernatural matters. They'd all given her the same answer. The curse could be broken, but only through sacrifice that made death seem merciful by comparison. Through the window, Miriam could see Samuel organizing his men, their movements carrying the purposeful efficiency of people preparing for violence. She understood that her time at the Broken Arrow Ranch was ending, but she also sensed that simply leaving wouldn't solve the problem. Her curse had been designed to follow her wherever she went, ensuring that isolation would never provide escape from the consequences of existing. Sarah continued arranging her protective talismans, working with the desperate focus of a woman trying to save everyone she cared about. But Miriam could see the futility in her efforts, because the power that had cursed her was older and stronger than any folk remedy could counter. Breaking this particular curse would require understanding its source, and that knowledge would lead them all into dangers that made death by supernatural speech seem gentle. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the ranch yard where David would never again tend the animals he'd loved, Miriam realized that her arrival had set in motion events that couldn't be stopped by good intentions or practical solutions. The curse that traveled with her wasn't just about killing animals with words. It was about destroying everything good and innocent that tried to help her find redemption. Sarah's investigation led them to Father Miguel, an aging priest who'd spent 40 years ministering to scattered communities across the southwest borderlands. He arrived at the ranch 3 days after David's funeral, his weathered face grave with the knowledge that supernatural troubles rarely resolved themselves through conventional means. Samuel had sent for him not from faith, but from desperation, willing to try any solution that might save his ranch from complete destruction. The priest examined Miriam with eyes that had witnessed every form of evil that flourished in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. He asked no questions about her condition, seemingly understanding from long experience that curses revealed themselves through consequences rather than explanations. Instead, he focused on the subtle signs that surrounded her: the way birds fell silent when she approached, how flowers withered in her presence, the strange shimmer that seemed to follow her movements like heat distortion. "This is old magic," Father Miguel told Samuel and Sarah during a private consultation conducted away from Miriam's hearing. "Older than Christianity, older than the missions we built to contain it. Someone with real power put this curse on her, and they designed it to last." Samuel absorbed this information with the grim acceptance of a man watching his world crumble around him. Since Miriam's arrival, he'd lost 3 horses, a dozen chickens, 2 cattle, and his best ranch hand. The surviving animals showed signs of supernatural terror, refusing to graze in certain areas, clustering together for protection against threats they couldn't understand but instinctively feared. But Sarah had made her own discoveries while nursing Miriam through the fever that had claimed her after David's death. During delirious moments, the younger woman had spoken fragments of her story, revealing details about the curse's origin that painted a picture of revenge spanning generations. Someone had wanted Miriam to suffer in very specific ways, turning her voice into an instrument of destruction that would isolate her from every human connection. The curse, according to Father Miguel's analysis, had been crafted with malicious precision. It didn't simply kill animals randomly. It targeted creatures that represented innocence, loyalty, or usefulness to the communities Miriam tried to join. Horses that carried hope, cattle that provided sustenance, pets that offered companionship, all became weapons used against their own caretakers, ensuring that Miriam's presence would always bring more harm than help. "Who did this to you?" Sarah asked during one of their careful written conversations, but Miriam's response revealed layers of tragedy that extended far beyond personal vengeance. "My grandmother was a healer," Miriam wrote. "She helped women in ways the church didn't approve. A missionary claimed she was a witch, had her burned. But before she died, she told me the real witch was someone who hated her for helping his wife leave him." The story unfolded through careful note exchanges, revealing that Miriam's curse wasn't random supernatural punishment, but calculated revenge spanning 2 generations. The man who'd arranged her grandmother's execution had also ensured that her granddaughter would suffer in ways that made death seem merciful. He'd wanted the healing bloodline to end in isolation and despair, unable to help anyone without destroying them. Father Miguel recognized the pattern from other cases he'd encountered along the borderlands, where old grudges festered across generations, and supernatural power was used to ensure that enemies suffered beyond the grave. "The man who cursed your grandmother is probably dead," he told Miriam, "but the magic he commissioned continues his revenge. Breaking it will require understanding exactly what he wanted to achieve." Samuel listened to these revelations with growing horror, not just at the supernatural implications, but at the human evil that had created such elaborate suffering. He'd assumed Miriam was simply an unfortunate victim of random misfortune, but the truth revealed a level of calculated malice that challenged his understanding of how far people would go to destroy their enemies. The priest's investigation also revealed why the curse had grown stronger since Miriam's arrival at the ranch. The magical working had been designed to feed on the victim's attempts to find community and connection, growing more powerful as she encountered people willing to help her. Every act of kindness, every gesture of support, every moment of human warmth became fuel for the supernatural force destroying everything she touched. Sarah wept when she understood the full implications, realizing that their attempts to help Miriam had actually made her condition worse. The food they'd shared, the shelter they'd provided, the genuine care they'd shown, all of it had strengthened the curse, ensuring that future victims would suffer even more than David and the animals that had already died. "There's a way to break it," Father Miguel said finally, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge that came at terrible cost. "But it requires sacrifice from the one who bears the curse. She has to willingly give up something more precious than life itself." Miriam had been watching this conversation through the window, reading their lips and understanding enough to know that salvation carried a price she wasn't sure she could pay. The curse could be broken, but only through an act of sacrifice that would end her suffering by ending everything else about her that mattered. The truth about breaking the curse came with conditions that made death seem like mercy. And Father Miguel delivered the details with the heavy reluctance of a man who'd witnessed too many impossible choices. According to the ancient texts he'd consulted, Miriam could end her supernatural torment, but only by sacrificing her ability to love, to be loved, or to remember what either emotion felt like. The curse could be transferred to her memories themselves, consuming every moment of joy, affection, or human connection she'd ever experienced. "You would live," the priest explained to their gathered group, "but you would exist in a state of complete emotional isolation. No memory of your grandmother's love, no recollection of kindness received or given, no capacity to form new attachments or recall old ones. You would be alive, but entirely alone, even in rooms full of people who cared about you." Miriam absorbed this information with the numb acceptance of someone who'd exhausted hope months ago. But Sarah reacted with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who'd already lost too many people to impossible choices. She'd come to love this strange, dangerous girl like the daughter she'd never had, and the thought of losing her to supernatural amputation of every emotional connection felt worse than simple death. Samuel struggled with different considerations, weighing the lives of his remaining animals and ranch hands against the complete spiritual destruction of one young woman. He was a practical man who'd made hard decisions before, but this choice operated on a scale that challenged every moral framework he'd used to navigate frontier life. Save the community by destroying an individual's capacity for human connection, or let the curse continue claiming innocent lives. But Sarah had been conducting her own investigation, and her discoveries revealed alternatives that Father Miguel's books hadn't mentioned. She'd spoken with old women in nearby settlements, curanderas who remembered stories from before the missions arrived and changed how people thought about supernatural justice. These women told different versions of curse breaking that involved community sacrifice rather than individual destruction. "There's another way," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the fierce determination of a mother protecting her child. "Instead of taking away her ability to love, we take the curse into ourselves, all of us, together. Spread it so thin among willing people that it loses its power to destroy." Father Miguel shook his head immediately, recognizing the proposal as the kind of noble suicide that destroyed entire communities. "The curse would adapt," he warned. "It would find ways to use multiple carriers to cause even more death. Instead of one woman killing animals with her voice, you'd have dozens of people killing them with every word, every breath, every heartbeat." But Miriam had been listening to this debate with growing understanding of what the curse actually represented. It wasn't random supernatural violence, it was a carefully constructed punishment designed to isolate her from human connection by making her presence deadly to everything innocent and loyal. The animals died not because magic hated them, but because their deaths would ensure Miriam could never belong anywhere. "I know who did this," she wrote on their slate, her handwriting growing more agitated as she worked through implications that had taken months to understand. "It wasn't just about revenge against my grandmother, it was about ensuring that healing knowledge died with our bloodline." The revelation shifted everything they thought they understood about the curse's purpose and structure. Miriam's grandmother had possessed knowledge about herbal medicine, midwifery, and women's health that certain powerful men wanted suppressed. They'd arranged her execution not just from religious zealotry, but from calculated desire to control female bodies and the knowledge that might free them from male authority. Sarah immediately grasped the larger implications, understanding that Miriam represented the last link to healing traditions that had been systematically destroyed across the borderlands. The curse wasn't just personal revenge, it was cultural genocide disguised as supernatural punishment, designed to ensure that women's knowledge would die in isolation and despair. If the curse is about destroying healing knowledge, Sarah reasoned, then maybe breaking it requires sharing that knowledge instead of hiding it. Maybe the sacrifice isn't about giving up love, but about giving up secrecy. Father Miguel considered this interpretation with growing excitement, recognizing that community-based curse-breaking aligned with older traditions that had been suppressed by institutional Christianity. Instead of individual salvation through personal sacrifice, the solution might involve collective action that honored what the curse was designed to destroy. But Miriam understood something the others hadn't yet grasped. Breaking this particular curse would require her to do more than share knowledge or accept community support. It would require her to become the kind of person her enemies had tried to prevent her from being, to embrace the healing power they'd wanted to destroy, even knowing that the process might kill her. The curse had been designed to prevent her from helping anyone, but breaking it would require her to help everyone, including the people who'd cursed her family. She would have to forgive enemies who'd destroyed 2 generations of women. offer healing to communities that had participated in her grandmother's execution, and find love for people who'd chosen fear over justice. The cost of understanding the curse's true nature revealed itself in ways that made previous losses seem insignificant, and Miriam spent 3 days in fevered contemplation of what breaking her bonds would actually require. The supernatural working hadn't just been designed to kill animals when she spoke. It had been crafted to prevent her from accessing the healing knowledge that was her birthright, ensuring that her grandmother's wisdom would die with the bloodline. Sarah had been gathering the scattered pieces of that lost knowledge, consulting with elderly women in surrounding settlements who remembered fragments of herbal lore and healing practices that had been driven underground by missionary influence. Each conversation revealed how much had been lost when Miriam's grandmother died, how many women had suffered without access to the medical knowledge that powerful men had labeled witchcraft. But the investigation also uncovered the identity of the man who'd commissioned the curse, and the revelation struck Miriam like a physical blow. Father Mendoza, the missionary who'd arranged her grandmother's execution, was still alive, still preaching in settlements across the borderlands, still working to suppress any healing knowledge that threatened church authority over women's bodies and reproductive choices. "He's not just alive," Sarah reported after speaking with travelers who'd encountered the priest recently. "He's actually expanded his campaign against curanderas. 3 more women have been executed for witchcraft in the past year, all of them healers who knew too much about preventing pregnancy or easing childbirth." The knowledge that her family's destroyer continued his work while she remained trapped by supernatural bonds filled Miriam with rage that threatened to consume what little emotional stability she'd maintained. Every woman who died because of Father Mendoza's crusade was partially her responsibility, because the healing knowledge that might have protected them was locked away behind the curse that made her voice deadly. Samuel watched this revelation unfold with growing understanding of why the curse had been designed to last so long and cause so much collateral damage. He didn't just want your grandmother dead, he realized. He wanted to make sure her knowledge could never be passed on, that no other women could learn what she knew about helping themselves. Father Miguel struggled with the implications of his colleagues' involvement in supernatural revenge. Torn between institutional loyalty and moral horror at what his fellow priest had accomplished, the Catholic Church officially condemned witchcraft and curse-making, but it had also created conditions where desperate men might seek such remedies when conventional authority proved insufficient. The priest's investigation revealed that Father Mendoza had commissioned the curse from a genuine witch, a woman whose power rivaled anything the church could offer, but whose loyalty could be purchased by men willing to pay appropriate prices. She'd created the supernatural working that trapped Miriam, but she'd also embedded conditions that could break it, insurance policies that protected her from spiritual retaliation. "The witch who made your curse is dead," Father Miguel explained, "but she left instructions for breaking it. You have to confront Father Mendoza directly, in a place where he feels most powerful, and offer him forgiveness for what he did to your family. The curse will break when you extend genuine mercy to your greatest enemy." The requirement seemed impossible, asking Miriam to forgive the man who destroyed 2 generations of women and continued destroying others. But Sarah understood the deeper logic of the magical working. Recognizing that the witch had designed a cure that would force Father Mendoza to confront the consequences of his actions while giving Miriam the opportunity for justice. "If you forgive him publicly," Sarah explained, "everyone will hear what he did. They'll understand that he used witchcraft to destroy women who were only trying to help their communities. His reputation will be ruined, his influence will end, and other women will be safe from his persecution." But offering forgiveness would require Miriam to speak extensively in Father Mendoza's presence, and her curse would kill every animal within miles before she finished explaining what he'd done to her family. The confrontation would take place in a settlement surrounded by livestock, horses, and pets belonging to people who had no connection to the supernatural war between healer and destroyer. Miriam faced an impossible choice: Remain cursed and allow Father Mendoza to continue destroying women, or break the curse by speaking words that would massacre innocent animals belonging to people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. Either path led to death and suffering, but only one offered the possibility that future generations might escape the cycle of persecution. Samuel and Sarah spent hours discussing alternatives, but every solution they proposed carried unacceptable costs or failed to address the curse's fundamental requirements. The magical working had been designed to trap Miriam in exactly this situation, forced to choose between personal freedom and community destruction, between justice and mercy, between healing and harm. As they prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether Miriam remained cursed or found freedom through sacrifice, she began to understand that the real choice wasn't between competing moral goods. It was between accepting the slow spiritual death of isolation and choosing the quick physical death that would break the curse permanently, freeing her family's knowledge for future generations while ensuring she could never personally benefit from the liberation. Father Mendoza stood in the mission courtyard like a monument to righteous authority, his black robes fluttering in the desert wind as he conducted evening prayers for a congregation that included families with children, elderly couples, and men who'd brought their horses and livestock to the settlement's weekly market. Miriam approached through the crowd with Sarah and Samuel flanking her like protective spirits, knowing that every step brought her closer to a confrontation that would end in either freedom or catastrophe. The priest recognized her immediately, his weathered face shifting from pastoral benevolence to something harder and more calculating as he processed the implications of her presence. He'd been waiting for this moment for almost a decade, anticipating that the curse he'd commissioned would eventually drive his victim to seek direct confrontation. His hand moved subtly toward the silver cross at his throat, not for spiritual comfort, but because it contained protective charms against the supernatural forces he'd unleashed. "I know why you've come," Father Mendoza announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the theatrical authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention through dramatic revelation. "This woman carries a curse, a punishment for the sins of her bloodline. Animals die when she speaks because her grandmother practiced witchcraft that offended God and nature." The congregation shifted nervously, parents pulling children closer while men positioned themselves near their valuable horses and cattle. They'd heard rumors about the strange woman who'd brought death to the Broken Arrow Ranch, but seeing her in person made the supernatural threat feel immediate and personal. Several families began quietly gathering their belongings, preparing to leave before whatever confrontation was brewing could claim their animals. But Sarah stepped forward with the fierce courage of a woman who'd decided that some battles were worth fighting regardless of consequences. "That's a lie," she declared, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the clarity of absolute conviction. "Her grandmother wasn't a witch. She was a healer who helped women, and you had her killed because you couldn't control the knowledge she possessed." Father Mendoza's expression darkened at this challenge to his narrative, but he maintained his composure with the practiced ease of a man who'd deflected accusations for decades. "Her grandmother practiced forbidden arts," he insisted. "She performed rituals that violated God's law and corrupted the natural order. The curse that follows her granddaughter is divine justice for those crimes." Miriam felt the words building in her throat like a dam about to burst, knowing that her response would either break the curse or turn the mission courtyard into a slaughterhouse. Around the perimeter, horses whinnied nervously while cattle pressed against their enclosures, somehow sensing the supernatural tension that was reaching a critical threshold. Children clung to their parents, and even the adults showed signs of primitive fear as they confronted forces beyond their understanding. "My grandmother," Miriam said, and immediately a dog near the mission entrance collapsed, its death serving as punctuation for her first words. The crowd gasped, and several people screamed, but she continued speaking despite the mounting casualties her voice was creating. "My grandmother was murdered by a man who used the very witchcraft he claimed to oppose. A horse in the market area fell to its knees, blood streaming from its mouth, But Miriam pressed on with desperate determination. Father Mendoza's face went white as he realized that her curse was about to expose truths he'd spent decades hiding. That every animal death would serve as evidence of the supernatural forces he'd wielded against innocent women. "You commissioned a curse from a real witch," Miriam continued, her voice growing stronger even as chickens began dying in yards throughout the settlement. "You paid her to ensure that my family's healing knowledge would die with me, that I could never help anyone without destroying them." The crowd was panicking now, running for cover as pets and livestock collapsed around them. But Miriam couldn't stop speaking until she'd delivered the complete truth that would break her curse. Father Mendoza attempted to shout over her, trying to drown out her revelations with prayers and commands, but her voice carried supernatural power that made silence impossible. "I forgive you," she said. And with those words, every animal within a mile radius died simultaneously, their collective death serving as the final sacrifice required to break the magical working that had imprisoned her for so long. The sudden silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of weeping from families who'd lost beloved pets and valuable livestock. But as the supernatural energy that had powered her curse dissipated into the desert air, Miriam felt something breaking apart inside her chest, a dissolution that went deeper than mere magic. The witch who'd created her curse had embedded one final condition, a requirement that the victim's life force be offered as payment for their freedom. Breaking the curse meant breaking herself, trading supernatural isolation for peaceful death. She collapsed in the mission courtyard with a smile on her face, finally free from the burden of carrying death in her voice, finally able to rest, knowing that her grandmother's healing knowledge would survive to help future generations. Sarah caught her as she fell, cradling her like the daughter she'd never had, understanding that love sometimes meant letting go of the people who mattered most. Father Mendoza fled the settlement that night, his reputation destroyed by the revelations that had cost so many innocent lives to deliver. The survivors would remember this day not for the animals that died, but for the truth that was finally spoken, the justice that was finally served, and the young woman who chose sacrifice over survival to break a cycle of persecution that had claimed too many healers. In the years that followed, Sarah would become the keeper of the knowledge that Miriam had died to preserve, sharing her grandmother's healing wisdom with women across the borderlands who needed alternatives to the medical authority that had failed them. The Broken Arrow Ranch would be remembered as the place where a curse was broken and a bloodline's wisdom was finally set free. The desert wind still carries whispers of her name, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, you can hear her voice teaching new generations of healers the secrets their grandmothers died protecting. Did Miriam's sacrifice break more than just her curse? What other secrets lie buried in the desert borderlands? Subscribe for more tales from the shadows between civilization and wilderness.